Hello, welcome to Pumping Python. My name is Jacob Itegweje. In this video, I'm going to cover list comprehensions as part of the data structures covering lists. List comprehensions are a way to create a list from an iterable. It's a simple way to go over every item in a list and perform an operation usually in one line. Let's start with how to create a list from an iterable. First, I add a test file. Say test list comprehensions, py. Add some boilerplate, unit tests, class, test, list, comprehensions, unit test, test case, define test, create a list from an iterable. So first I create a container. I'm going to use the range object. The range object creates an iterable of numbers up to the number that you give it. So in this case, I'm going to go from 0 to 9. And then I add a list. This is an empty list. And just to confirm, I'm going to add a test that says the empty list contains something. It should fill, says it's an empty list. So I know that my list for sure doesn't contain anything. And then I do for item in container, a list dot append item and self dot assert equal a list, and it should be something else. So, and it shows, but I get an assertion error because my list has changed. In the beginning, it's empty, and then I loop through container, which is a range object and iterable in this case. And on every iteration, on every loop through, it adds the item. So the first time it's 0, it added a 0. The second time is 1, it added a 1, and so on until it got all the way to the end. We need to add those values to the test so that the test can pass. And 9, not 0. All right. We have passing test. Good. I can make a list from any iterable by looping over it. Another way is I could use the list constructor. So I'm going to add a test for that, say self.assert equal, and I use the list constructor on container, and it shows me an assertion error. The values are the same, so I can change that to just a list. And then for good measure, I'm going to do it inside a program. So I add list comprehensions here, say list comprehensions dot make a list. It will take container as its input, and I'm expecting it to return a list. I get a name error. I'm going to add that to my list of exceptions encountered. We have an assertion error at the beginning. Now we have a name error. To fix the name error, I go to the top and I add an import statement. Say import list comprehensions. The terminal gives me a module not found error, so I add that. Say module not found error. And to fix that, I need to add a new file. So I say list comprehensions.py, and that makes the module not found error go away. The terminal tells me that I have no attribute make a list. That is correct. So I'm going to add a function called make a list to list comprehensions.py and make a list, parentheses, it returns nothing, or it returns none in the beginning. I get a type error saying make a list takes 0 positional arguments but 1 was given. I'm sending in container, but this doesn't accept any, so I add argument to make it pass, and we get an assertion error. None is not equal to this list of numbers. That's correct. So to do that, I have to change the none, and I say list argument, and I see the test pass. So from this test, I know that I can make a list from any iterable by using the list constructor. I'm going to change this name just so I'm explicit. Change it to iterable. That seems more clear than just argument. All right, that's how to create a list using the list constructor. Now, how to create a list with a for loop. You've already kind of seen this in the previous example. Let's create an explicit example for it. Test creating a list with a for loop. So I do the same thing I did before. I'm going to create a range of numbers. I'll call it container. Create an empty list. Verify that the list is empty. Say list. Yeah, it's empty. And then I loop over the container. Say a list dot append item self dot assert equal a list self dot assert equal, call something from the list comprehensions that does the same thing I'm doing in the test, and this should be equal to a list. All right. Terminal shows me that these two are not equal, so I fill it in with the values. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then I get an attribute error for the for loop method. Let's add one. So I say define for loop. I know I'm sending in an iterable, and I wanted to do something with that information. Start with return none. I get a failure. And so I'm going to use a loop just like this to send a result that should look like this. I start with the empty list, say result is empty, and then I go over each item in the iterable. So item in iterable, result.append item, and then finally return the result. And we have pass and tests. So now we know two ways. I can make a list from an iterable by using the list constructor. I can do it also by using a for loop. Now let's do list comprehensions, which is the reason for this entire exercise. Define tests, creating lists with list comprehensions. Same thing, I say container equals range. I have an empty list. I verify that my empty list is empty just because. I say for item in container a list dot append. All right. And then self dot assert equal that the list is changed after I do that operation. It's changed. It's the same result we've had so far. Then I try it again with a list comprehension this time. So I'm going to say empty list and then a list. Should get an error. And the way to write a list comprehension is you say what you want to do. So the item and then the loop statement. It looks like this. Item for item in container. And I should make things pass. I add another one just to repeat it for practice, and I say list comprehensions dot list comprehension container, and I'm expecting a list as my result. If you get an attribute error, I'm going to define list comprehension. I know it's going to take in an iterable, return on first, then change the return statement to match the list comprehension statement. So item for item in iterable. All right, that's how you write a list comprehension, but there's more you can do with it. We could also add conditions. Let's add a test for a list comprehension with conditions. Let's say define test list comprehensions with conditions. Okay, container is just a range object. Even numbers is an empty list. Say self.assert equal. Even numbers is empty in the beginning. Then I go for item in container. And every time it loops, I want it to do this operation. This is the modulo operator, which takes a number and divides it by another number and gives you the remainder. In this case, I'm taking the number, whatever item is, doing a modulo operation to divide by 2. And if the value of dividing by 2, if the remainder, sorry, is 0, then it should add it to the even numbers list. So when it loops through, we're expecting to see only even numbers. So even numbers, and the terminal shows us 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. Those are the even numbers. It's right. We can also do this with a list comprehension. So I say this, even numbers. I know from before that it's item for item in container, but that gives me everything. So I need the condition to break it down to only give me the even numbers. I do that by simply adding the condition. I say if item modulo 2 is equal to 0. And we have passing test. Very nice. Let's do it by calling a function in the program. So list comprehensions and say get even numbers. I give it the container, my range object or my iterable, and I'm expecting even numbers back as my result. I get a complaint. So I add the function even numbers, and that's going to take in an iterable and return none so that I can compare. None is not equal to 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. So I have to change the function to return the iterable, the list comprehension. So item for item in iterable if item modulo 2 is equal to 0, the test pass. Let's add another one. Let's do a different condition. Say one for odd numbers. Conditions. I'm going to change this to conditions 1. So that is a difference. Conditions 1 and say conditions 2 on the second one. All right. So we have container is equal to range 10. Odd numbers is an empty list. Verify that it's empty. And then I say for item in container, if item modulo 2 is not equal to 0, add it to the odd numbers list. And then I verify that it adds the right thing. So odd numbers, empty list, it says no. It's 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. That's correct. I add 1 for a list comprehension. And I use the one I did in even numbers for item in container. If item modulo 2 is equal to 0, that gives me a list of even numbers, but I want odd numbers. When I change this to a not equal sign, the test passes. Progress. So now I'll do it with a call to the function, say get odd numbers, and takes in container as input, and the expectation is we get odd numbers back. I get an attribute error. I add the function, say get odd numbers, takes in iterable, return item for item in iterable if item modulo 2 is not equal to 0. All right, there you have it. These tests have shown that I can create a list using a list comprehension from any iterable with conditions. So these two contain conditions. I can do it without conditions. I can do it with a for loop. The difference between a list comprehension and a for loop is in the for loop, I have to initialize an empty list and then perform the operation, whereas with a list comprehension, I can do all of that in one line, even when I'm doing conditions. And I can also just make a list from an iterable. If you typed along, you now know a couple of ways to look through iterables and have your program make decisions by using conditions. You also know how to do it with less words, so your magic powers are growing. That's it. See you in the next one.